I found my daughter-in-law's Betrayal stitched into a quilt I had sewn with my own hands years before she stole everything from me. That wall hanging now hangs in my sharp, stitch of Betrayal quilts as a silent witness, and every quilt she hand-labels there carries the words, "I unraveled family trust," because a judge gave me a gift far better than revenge. Her garnished wages now fund the very sewing program that rebuilt my life, one careful stitch at a time. Let me tell you exactly how the threads unraveled, from the first snipped seam to the final knot. My name is Lydia, I'm 57 years old, and before the world split at its seams, I taught family and consumer sciences at Maplewood High for 32 years. That curriculum was never just baking soda volcanoes and sewing a straight line. I taught teenagers to balance a household budget on minimum wage, to read a credit card agreement line by line, and to test a pressure regulator on a gas stove. My late husband Tom, a quiet architect who believed every structure needed a foundation nobody could see, died of a stroke 6 years ago and left me a life insurance payout of $112,000. That money sat in a high-yield savings account for 3 years, earning almost nothing while I grieved. Our only son Jacob was killed in a motorcycle accident 2 years before that, and his widow, Caitlin, became the daughter I thought I'd been given to fill the silence. She was charming, razor-sharp with a spreadsheet, and after Tom's death she wove herself around me like morning glory on a trellis. She remembered my birthday with homemade lemon bars, she drove me to every doctor's appointment, and she used to say I was the only family she had left. I didn't see the thorns until I was already tangled. I sank every penny of that inheritance into buying a historic quilt fabric shop called the Calico, cupboard from a woman named Miss Iris Hardesty, a legend in the vintage textile world. The building was a 2-story brick storefront on Main Street, with original tin ceilings and wide plank pine floors that smelled of beeswax and decades of sizing spray. Miss Iris had spent 40 years accumulating a staggering collection of original feed sack and Depression-era fabric patterns, hand-painted artwork from the 1930s filed in acid-free boxes, inside a basement vault that ran on a dehumidifier system she had installed in 1987. Those patterns were worth a fortune to collectors, but to Miss Iris they were history, and she had refused every offer to sell them piecemeal. She trusted me to steward that legacy because I had been her student 40 years earlier, and I was the only person she knew who could identify a 1932 Sears Roebuck feedsack print by touch alone. Caitlin notarized a 50-50 partnership agreement, signed in front of 2 witnesses, and swore on Jacob's memory that she'd honor my lifetime teaching role in the sunny back studio, a room with a wall of north-facing windows, where I planned to run sewing classes for widows and at-risk teens. The ink on that agreement was barely dry when Caitlin started insisting we upgrade the point-of sale system and move the antique thread cabinets into the basement to make room for more modern displays. I agreed to a few changes because I thought she had a head for business. In retrospect, she was already rearranging the furniture to her own advantage. 3 months after we signed the papers, Miss Iris passed away in her sleep at 83. That's when the clock started ticking on a betrayal I never saw coming. Her attorney called Caitlin first, because Caitlin had inserted herself as the emergency contact on every form, and within 3 hours Caitlin and her new husband, Brad, a man with a shellacked smile, and a leased BMW that smelled of artificial new-car scent, stood in Miss Iris's dusty Victorian house talking about estate logistics, as though they'd been waiting for the old woman's lungs to give out. They hadn't visited Iris in months, not since the day we signed the partnership papers, and Brad had taken a selfie in front of the shop's vintage sign, but suddenly they played the roles of devoted executors of memory. Brad kept checking his phone for a closing date on a lake house they clearly couldn't afford. I felt sick standing in the parlor, surrounded by Iris's collection of antique spool cabinets and shoeboxes full of mother-of-pearl buttons. Caitlin touched things with 2 fingers, like she was appraising items for a garage sale, and I could already see her calculating square footage and listing fees. I told myself I was being paranoid. We were supposed to be cleaning, sorting what to donate. I wandered into Iris's sewing room, a tiny sunlit space with a treadle machine and a corkboard full of yellowed pattern envelopes. A faint smell of lavender and old cotton hung in the air, and the floorboards creaked under the worn braided rug. And there, folded over a wooden drying rack, was the wall hanging I'd made for her 80th birthday 3 years earlier. I recognized every stitch, every deliberate choice I'd made while listening to Tom's old jazz records in my own sewing room. It was a 12 by 18-inch quilted banner depicting an old-fashioned black Singer sewing machine with a spool of crimson thread set against a cream and gold Ohio star block. The binding was hand-stitched in exactly 318 stitches per side. I knew because I'd counted them obsessively to get the tension perfect. I'd backed it with a piece of reproduction 1930s feed sack printed with tiny bluebonnets, a scrap Miss Iris had given me from her own stash. I held it up, my throat tight with grief. Caitlin glanced over from the doorway, her arms full of dusty lace curtains she intended to toss. "That old thing. Give it to Goodwill, Lydia. It's not worth anything. We need to clear the house fast, the realtor is coming Thursday." I didn't argue. I set it down, waited until she and Brad left to talk to a locksmith about the sharp basement, and then I folded the wall hanging and slid it into my oversized canvas tote beneath a stack of old quilting magazines. It was just a sentimental piece, I told myself. I just wanted a piece of Iris. That night, alone in the small guest bedroom of Caitlin's house where I'd been staying since the funeral, I sat cross-legged on the bed and examined the wall hanging under a bright craft light. Something felt off in the way the fabric draped. The weight was slightly heavier than it should have been, a few ounces maybe, but enough that my fingers registered it when I pressed the center. I smoothed it flat and ran my palm over the surface, feeling a faint rectangular stiffness between the top piecing and the cotton batting, a subtle aberration that most people would never notice. I know quilts the way a surgeon knows fascia. The quilting lines around the sewing machine motif were slightly different from my own work, the spacing just a millimeter wider, and the thread had a faintly deeper twist, the kind Miss Iris always used after her arthritis worsened, because it was easier to pull through the layers without knotting. Someone had carefully removed the original quilting and resewn it by hand, matching my pattern almost perfectly. I snipped 2 threads near the binding with my embroidery scissors, the small Jingher ones with the micro-serrated blades, and I separated the backing from the batting with the slow precision of a woman who's unpicked thousands of seams. The fabric layers peeled apart with a soft, cottony sigh, and inside, folded into a perfect square no bigger than a tea napkin, were 2 sheets of thin legal paper, typed with original signatures in blue ink. My heart stopped when I saw the heading, Partnership Agreement, The Calico Cupboard, LLC. It was our original contract, the one I thought had been filed away in Caitlin's fireproof safe. Below it a handwritten note on lined yellow paper, the kind Iris used for grocery lists in her shaky cursive. I read it 3 times, my hands trembling so badly I had to press the paper flat against my knee. Lydia, do not trust them. 2 weeks ago I heard Caitlin on the phone with Brad saying the patterns alone are worth $600,000. She said you were going to be too broken to notice when she dissolved the partnership. I took this from her office last month when I still had keys. She thinks it's lost. I'm stitching it here because you're the only one who would ever look inside my quilts. Save yourself. Get a lawyer, Iris. Before I continue this story, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the truth you stitch into your work will always find its way to the light. Now, I'll tell you exactly how I unspooled their whole scheme. By the next morning, Caitlin and Brad had already transitioned from grieving to asset management. They sat me down at their granite kitchen island, a plate of untouched scones between us like a centerpiece from a magazine shoot, and Brad began with a gentle tone that sounded practiced in a mirror. He explained they were worried about my stress levels and wanted to simplify things so I could focus on healing. Caitlin dabbed her eyes with a tissue and said, "Mom, I just can't bear to see you burdened with the books and the roof repairs. You've already given so much." Then Brad slid a manila folder across the counter. Inside was a document titled Mutual Dissolution of Partnership and Voluntary Transfer of Assets, already drafted by a lawyer named Hargrove, whose letterhead looked suspiciously like a template from an online legal service. The language was dense, but the meaning was clear. I would sign away my entire stake in the Calico Cupboard, all inventory, all intellectual property, the building itself, in exchange for a one-time payment of $12,000 and a lifetime right to teach a single class per week in the back room at the owner's discretion. The owner's discretion. I read that phrase 3 times. The $3,500 gratitude check would come later, but this was the first knife. I let my hands tremble. I asked them to repeat themselves twice. I squinted at the page as if it were a tax form in a foreign language. I said I'd need to think about it, maybe next week. I was just too foggy from the funeral. I didn't pick up a pen. Brad's jaw tightened, but he forced a smile and squeezed my shoulder as if I were a stubborn child. That's when they suggested I move into their guest house, just for a few months so you're not alone in that empty condo. Caitlin added, "We'll take care of everything, Mom. You can just be the heart of the shop." I agreed because I needed to be inside their perimeter, and I could see the relief flicker across their faces. They thought they had just herded the old lady into the pen. The guest house was a converted garage with a separate entrance, 60 feet from their back deck, and connected by a flagstone path. It had a small kitchenette, a bathroom, and a single window that looked directly at the sliding glass door of the main house. It gave me the perfect observation post. I packed my sewing machine, my fabric stash, and a small tool kit that had been Tom's, the one with the pipe wrench, the old screwdrivers, and a tiny set of precision files. I also packed a small spiral notebook that I intended to fill with every detail I could gather. I played the part of the grieving, compliant mother-in-law who just needed to be taken care of. Every day, Caitlin would bring over a mug of herbal tea and ask softly if I'd had a chance to look at the paperwork. Every day, I'd smile vaguely and talk about a quilt block I was designing, a double ring pattern that required absolute precision, and I'd ask her to repeat what the papers said because my memory wasn't what it used to be. She'd explain with exaggerated patience, and I'd nod and say I'd sleep on it. They were in a hurry, and I needed them to think I moved at the speed of molasses. Meanwhile, I started taking notes in that notebook, which I kept hidden inside a hollowed-out quilting book on my nightstand. I carved the cavity myself with a box cutter and some careful patience, a trick I'd learned from a library book on espionage in the 1970s. From my window, I mapped their movements like a forensic accountant tracking a money launderer. Brad's phone calls grew more frantic by the day. I'd hear him pacing the deck, his voice pitched low but leaking through the glass whenever I cracked the bathroom window. The first call I caught was on a Tuesday. "No, the deed hasn't transferred yet. We're working on the old lady. I told Heritage we'd have the full pattern catalogue by the 15th. They've already wired the earnest money to the escrow account, but we can't close without her signature on the intellectual property assignment. No, I can't forge it, she'd contest it, and we can't have that kind of noise." He was juggling plates made of glass. I realized I needed a more reliable recording method than my ears, so I took an old smartphone I'd kept in a drawer, wiped it clean, and installed a voice-activated recording app. I tucked it into the soil of a large potted fern on the deck, right next to the railing where Brad liked to lean during his calls, and I camouflaged it with a few dead leaves. The microphone was sensitive enough to pick up everything within 10 feet, and over the next week it captured 7 separate conversations in which Brad discussed the fraudulent sale, the forged signature, and the deadline pressure. I found out later they'd already taken a $90,000 line of credit against the shop's building, using a forged resolution from a partnership meeting that never happened. The resolution bore my signature, a clumsy rendering I'd later compare to the real one under a loop. Brad had used the money to put a down payment on a ski boat and a timeshare in Breckenridge. Bank statements later showed the loan was teetering on default, with a balloon payment due in 30 days. Their entire financial life was a house of cards, and the sale of the vintage patterns was the only thing that could save them from a very public collapse. A week into my stay, the plumbing gods delivered an opportunity. A pipe burst in the guest house's kitchenette, a cheap flex hose that had probably been installed by the previous owner. Water sprayed across the drywall in a fine mist, and the place smelled like a wet dog within minutes. Brad came stomping over, tried to crank the shut-off valve under the sink, and stripped the handle clean off. He cursed and called a plumber, but the soonest they could come was the next morning. I didn't wait. I still remembered how to sweat copper fittings from the year Tom and I replumbed our first house, a 1920s bungalow with original knob and tube wiring, and a plumbing system held together by hope. I found a pipe wrench in Tom's kit, walked outside to the main water shut-off near the driveway, and killed the supply to the whole property. Then I used 2 adjustable wrenches and a bit of plumber's tape to remove the broken valve stem, clean the seat with a wire brush, and screw in a new quarter-turn valve I'd found under the bathroom sink, a spare from when Brad had tried to fix his own master shower and given up. I packed the nut with fresh fiber packing, turned the water back on, and not a drop leaked. The plumber the next morning told Brad it was a solid temporary fix, better than anything he'd seen a homeowner do. Brad stared at me like I'd just performed open-heart surgery on his dog. That moment planted the first crack in their underestimation. They thought they were dealing with a doddering widow who only knew quilting. They forgot I'd spent 3 decades teaching hundreds of girls how to read a pattern, balance a household budget, and fix a leaky faucet because home economics was never just about cookies and aprons. I could read a P&L statement, I could rebuild a carburetor if I had a diagram, and I knew how to open a lock without a key because my father had taught me when I was 12, and convinced I might become a detective. That lark skill became essential 2 days later. Brad left for a golf outing with a real estate developer, and Caitlin drove to a lunch meeting she said was with a fabric distributor. The main house was empty, and my heart hammered as I crossed the flagstone path barefoot, dressed in dark clothing just in case a neighbor glanced over the fence. I knew Brad's home office was in the walkout basement, behind a solid core door with a Schlage keypad lock, the kind that used a solenoid to retract the latch. My dad had shown me how to bypass these with a strong rare earth magnet and a thin strip of metal. I'd never done anything even slightly illegal before, but Iris's note had dissolved any hesitation. I cut a strip from a Red Bull can with my sewing shears, roughly 2 inches long and 1/4 inch wide, and I shaped one end into a small hook with my bent-tip needle nose pliers. I also carried a neodymium magnet about the size of a quarter that I had salvaged from an old hard drive. Downstairs, the basement air was cool and smelled of concrete sealant. I pressed my ear to the office door and heard nothing, then examined the keypad housing. The solenoid mechanism was visible through a small gap in the door weather stripping, a tiny metal barrel that controlled the deadbolt. I positioned the magnet directly over it, feeling the magnetic field tug, and after a moment I heard the soft click of the latch retracting. I then slid the hooked strip behind the strike plate, engaged the locking bolt, and nudged it upward with a gentle twist. The lock snicked open in 6 seconds. My hands were steady, my pulse was a drum, but I was inside. I photographed the entire room first, wide-angle shots with my phone, and then I began a systematic search, noting the position of every paper so I could restore it exactly. The office smelled like stale coffee and cheap cologne. A filing cabinet stood in the corner, its top drawer locked, but the key was in a pencil cup on the desk, as if Brad thought no one would ever be smart enough to look there. Inside, I found a folder labeled Calico IP Transfer that contained a fully drafted sale agreement between the Calico Cupboard LLC and Heritage Home Textiles, Inc., for $650,000, assigning all vintage pattern rights with an appendix listing every single box in the basement vault. The signature page had my name forged in a clumsy, back-slanted imitation, dated 3 weeks prior. Another folder held a competency assessment that Brad had commissioned from a private investigator, complete with a report full of fabricated anecdotes, claims that I'd been seen wandering in the grocery store parking lot, that I'd forgotten my own address, that a neighbor's security camera captured me putting my keys in the refrigerator. They were building a case to get conservatorship if I refused to sign, and the report even included a draft petition to the probate court with my name already filled in. The cruelty of the premeditation stole my breath for a solid 10 seconds. The most damning file was a thick accordion folder of bank and loan documents. The $90,000 line of credit against the shop was listed with a balance of $87,400, payment 30 days past due. A cash flow projection showed that if the sale didn't close by November 20th, the bank would initiate foreclosure and call the personal guarantee Brad had forged in my name. There was also a personal loan for $45,000 using the shop's inventory as collateral, with a note scrawled in the margin, "Must pay off by 11/15 or boat repo." I found copies of emails between Brad and a graphic designer, asking to remove the stitch watermark I'd embedded in the high-resolution scans of the vintage patterns because I had digitized them myself with a subtle security feature only I knew about, a single broken thread in the digitized weave, visible only when you zoomed to 400%. He needed my admin password to access the original server files. I had never given it to him. I took a small USB flash drive from my sewing kit, plugged it into Brad's computer, and copied every folder I could find, including a backup of his email archive that contained an entire thread titled Lydia Dementia Strategy. I wiped down the keyboard with a corner of my shirt, relocked the filing cabinet, and on my way out I noticed a wastebasket full of shredded paper. Among the confetti I saw the words dissolution and notary and Caitlin Harley's. I scooped several handfuls into a Ziploc bag, knowing that reassembling shredded documents would be tedious, but that I had the time and the patience of a woman who once spent 400 hours hand-quilting a king-size wedding ring pattern. That night, I locked myself in the guest house and set up a reassembly station on the small kitchen table. I laid out sheets of wax paper and a roll of clear tape, and I began sorting the strips under a bright LED task light. The shredder had been the cheap cross-cut type, so the pieces were confetti-sized but not dust. I worked in sections, grouping strips by the color of the paper and the font, testing joins like a jigsaw puzzle. It took me 5 hours, with only the hum of the dehumidifier for company. By dawn, I had reconstructed a draft of the fraudulent dissolution document that Caitlin had signed as notary, attached to an email from Brad that said, "She'll never remember signing it." I also reassembled a letter from a bank officer warning that the line of credit would be called within 30 days due to irregular activity, and an email from Brad to Caitlin that read, "Once the old bat is declared incompetent, we can liquidate the whole place and move to Florida." I photocopied each reassembled page and sealed the originals in a plastic sleeve, then added them to my growing evidence file. The pieces were coming together, but I needed an ally who could translate this into legal firepower. I still had Miss Iris's note, and I remembered that she had mentioned an attorney named Mr. Finch. The next morning I drove to a payphone outside a gas station because I didn't trust my cell phone in that house, and I called the number Iris had scribbled on the corner of a recipe card she'd once given me for lemon lavender scones. Mr. Finch answered in a kind, gravelly voice, and I told him about the wall hanging, the note, the forged documents in Brad's office. He listened silently, then said, "Miss Hardesty anticipated something like this. She added a codicil to her will and set up a blind trust for the Calico Cupboard's intellectual property, specifically the vintage patterns. The trust stipulates that any sale, license, or transfer of those patterns requires the physical presence and notarized consent of Lydia Ann Harleys personally, not by proxy, not by power of attorney, not by any substitute." She also placed the original copyright registrations in a safety deposit box at First Midwest Bank, with the key held by you. I sent that key and a letter by registered mail 3 weeks ago to your address on file, which was Caitlin's house. I assumed you'd received it. My skin went cold. Caitlin must have intercepted it. I asked Mr. Finch if I could get a duplicate key, and he said he'd request one from the bank with an expedited court order, but it might take a few days. He also said something that changed the entire trajectory. The U.S. Attorney's Office has been building a case against Brad and Caitlin for a separate art fraud scheme involving fake print editions. They've been looking for a way in. With what you've found, they may have enough for a RICO indictment. I'd like to introduce you to an agent named Marlowe. I met Special Agent Alicia Marlowe that afternoon in a coffee shop parking lot, the kind of place with bad lighting and no loyalty cards. She was a sharp-faced woman in her 40s who listened without interrupting, then took my USB drive and the reconstructed shredded documents as if they were made of evidence. She told me that Brad and Caitlin were already on a federal radar for a boiler room operation selling counterfeit Amish quilts online, and my discovery tied directly to interstate wire fraud and elder financial exploitation. She needed one more thing, and she asked if I'd be willing to help collect it. I said yes before she finished the sentence. Agent Marlowe handed me a small device, a USB dongle no larger than a thumbnail, that functioned as a keystroke logger. She explained that they needed direct proof that Brad was accessing the Heritage escrow account with fraudulent credentials, and if I could install this on his computer, it would capture passwords, account numbers, and the timing of his transactions. So 2 days later, when I knew Brad and Caitlin were at a charity gala they'd been talking about for weeks, I went back into the office. This time my hands were even steadier. The lock yielded to the same magnet and hook technique in 5 seconds. I found his desktop tower under the desk, and I carefully plugged the logger into a rear USB port, where it was hidden by the monitor cable. The device was designed to silently record every keystroke and store the data on a tiny internal flash memory. I wiped my prints with a microfiber cloth, relocked the door, and returned the magnet to my sewing kit. 4 days later, during another window of opportunity, I retrieved the logger. The data showed that Brad had logged into an escrow account at Midwest Escrow Services using credentials he'd obtained by social engineering a customer service rep, and he'd initiated a transfer of $25,000 to his personal checking account to cover the boat payment. That was the final piece Marlowe needed. But before I let Agent Marlowe move in, I had to know if a single speck of humanity remained in the woman I'd once called my daughter. I needed to test the depths of their cruelty, so I could sever whatever invisible threads still connected me to Caitlin. I staged a medical crisis. I had a bottle of baby aspirin and some expired nitroglycerin tablets from Tom's old cardiac kit. On a Friday afternoon, when I knew they were both home and in the living room, I walked in clutching my chest, my breathing deliberately shallow, and dropped to my knees beside the couch. I practiced this collapse in front of a mirror 3 times, timing my gasps and making sure my color looked pale. I let my voice go weak and breathy. "Caitlin, my heart, I think it's a heart attack. Call 911, please hurry." I watched her face cycle through surprise, calculation, and then something so flat it made my stomach turn. She froze. Brad came running from the kitchen, saw me on the floor, and instead of reaching for the phone on the end table, he stepped directly over my legs. His loafer brushed my knee. He knelt by the side table where I'd set my handbag, dumped its contents onto the hardwood, and poured through my pens and tissues until he found my small leather-bound notary journal and my stamp. He held it up like a trophy. "Got it," he said, his voice utterly calm. Caitlin looked down at me, her face twisted not with concern but with impatience, and she actually said, "Mom, just stay still, we'll get help right after you sign one thing, okay?" She pulled a folded document from her own purse, something she'd had ready, probably the IP assignment with a fresh signature line and a notary block. They hadn't even discussed calling 911. They were waiting for me to become incapacitated enough to not resist. I let myself recover, slowly, gasping that the pain had passed, that I just needed to lie down. I refused to sign anything while I was dizzy, and they backed off, disappointed but still playing the role of concerned caregivers. The moment the door closed behind me, I locked myself in the guest house and sat on the floor, shaking. Not from fear, but from the cold, clarifying relief of knowing there was nothing left to salvage. That night I called Agent Marlowe and told her I was ready. She prepared me with a slim digital transmitter the size of a matchbook, a device I would hide inside a quilted panel in my cardigan collar. I stayed up all night designing the concealment, stitching a fabric channel between 2 layers of interfacing and cotton, routing the wires so they wouldn't print against the fabric. My sewing skills turned me into a bespoke surveillance operative. I used a fine silk thread that wouldn't cause bulk, and I sealed the edges with a tiny blanket stitch that looked purely decorative. By Sunday evening the collar looked like a simple ruffled detail. I tried it on, and Marlowe's tech team confirmed the audio was pristine. The plan was set for Monday morning at First Midwest Bank. Brad had told me we were going to review the sharp safety deposit box contents to consolidate them with Iris's estate. In reality, they needed my physical presence to satisfy the blind trust requirement and finalize the heritage sale before the November 20th foreclosure deadline, which was now 3 days away. He was so desperate that he didn't even bother with a plausible cover story. He just assumed I was too foggy to question anything. I dressed in a navy blue cardigan with the transmitter sewn into the left collar point, carried my handbag containing the original partnership agreement from the quilt and a copy of Iris's note, and climbed into their Lexus with the steady calm of a woman who had already won. In the bank's marble lobby, a woman in a grey suit guided us to a small conference room. A notary and a bank officer were already seated at the table, and a stack of documents waited there like an accusation. Brad pulled out a chair for me with exaggerated courtesy. "Just sign the flagged pages, Lydia. This secures your retirement and Caitlin can finally focus on honouring your legacy." Caitlin stood behind him, her arms crossed, her eyes flat like buttons on a doll. I could see a faint tremor in her hand when she laid out a pen. I didn't take it. I set my own pen down with a deliberate click and looked directly at her. "You forgot the first rule of quilting," I said, my voice steady and carrying in the quiet room. "Every seam you rip leaves a scar. I am done letting you unravel my life." I slid the original partnership agreement onto the table, the one Miss Iris had hidden inside the quilt, its signatures still true. "This is a valid 50-50 partnership, notarized by Caitlin herself. The dissolution you drafted is a forgery, and the shredded copy you threw away has been reconstructed and is already in the hands of the FBI." Caitlin's face drained of color. Brad lunged for the document, but the bank officer, an older man with a retired military bearing, stepped forward and blocked him with a single palm. At that exact moment, the conference room door opened and Agent Marlowe walked in, her badge held at chest height, followed by 2 uniformed officers. Caitlin began shrieking that I was unstable, that I'd been diagnosed with dementia, that I'd planted evidence. Marlowe didn't flinch. She played back a snippet from her tablet, Brad's voice recorded less than 5 minutes earlier in the parking lot. "Just forge the notary seal if she balks, nobody checks." The audio filled the room with his own damning words. The notary at the table stood and backed away, as if the documents were toxic. The bank officer triggered a silent alarm that locked the branch's internal systems down to prevent any electronic transfers. Brad and Caitlin were arrested on charges of forgery, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit elder financial abuse, and intellectual property theft. The handcuffs clicked with a sound I will never forget, a metallic period at the end of a very long sentence. The bank freeze started within hours, locking the fraudulent line of credit and voiding the attempted property transfer. The heritage sale was declared unenforceable due to fraudulent inducement, and the company's general counsel even called Mr. Finch to apologize and offer to renegotiate a legitimate license directly with me. The aftermath was methodical and deeply satisfying. Brad's case went to federal court because the wire fraud crossed multiple state lines, and because the boiler room art scheme Agent Marlowe had been investigating elevated the charges to a RICO predicate. He was sentenced to 46 months in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of $215,000, which covered the embezzled funds, my legal fees, and the cost of the forensic audit. The ski boat was repossessed before the ink dried on the judgment, the timeshare forfeited, and his BMW was seized by the bank. Caitlin's fate took a different shape. Because the partnership agreement was valid, and because she had breached her fiduciary duty in a way the judge called egregious and premeditated, the civil court awarded me full ownership of the Calico cupboard and its entire intellectual property portfolio. Her 50% stake was extinguished as a punitive measure. But the judge didn't stop there. He ordered Caitlin to perform 500 hours of community service specifically at my new business, and he imposed a wage garnishment of 30% on any income she earned going forward, with the garnished funds directed to a charitable program of my choosing. She is forbidden from overseeing any financial operations, from accessing the shop's bank accounts, and from contacting me beyond what is strictly necessary to receive her weekly assignment. She must report to the shop every Saturday morning at 8 o'clock sharp, and her sole job is to hand-sew a label onto every product we sell. Each label reads in navy thread on cream cotton, "I unraveled family trust," and below it, the date and a small reference number that corresponds to the court order. She sits in the front window, visible to the street, stitching labels for hours while customers watch. The humiliation is severe, but the wage garnishment is her penance. Every dollar taken from her paycheck goes directly into the Iris Hardesty Memorial Sewing Program, which I run out of the back teaching studio, now fully mine. We teach sewing skills to women fleeing domestic violence, providing them with a trade, free supplies, and a path to economic independence. The program has already graduated 12 women who now work as tailors, upholsterers, and small batch designers. The shop was renamed Stitch of Betrayal Quilts with full court approval, and the wall hanging that held the agreement hangs in a shadow box above the register, backlit and tagged with a small plaque that tells the story without ever mentioning Caitlin by name. I sold the vintage pattern collection myself, but on my own terms. I licensed the patterns to Heritage for a flat fee of $650,000, with royalty residuals and strict protections requiring attribution to the Calico Cupboard Archive in perpetuity. The lump sum paid off the fraudulent loans, restored the building's historic tin ceiling and original oak floors, and funded the shelter program for at least 10 years. I still teach the Thursday Night Widows Circle, a group of 11 women who bring their own scraps and their own stories, and I still work the counter on Tuesdays because I like the way the afternoon light hits the thread rack. Caitlin tried to appeal the sentence, arguing that the community service was cruel and unusual because it exposed her to public ridicule. The appellate court dismissed it with a one-sentence opinion: the punishment fits the crime. She cannot speak to me beyond what is required for her labeling assignment, and some Saturdays she cries, some Saturdays she just glares at her needle, and I don't engage. I just hand her a stack of labels and walk away. Justice, I learned, doesn't have to be loud. It can be as quiet as a needle pulling thread through cotton, as permanent as the words you leave behind. Iris taught me that, from beyond a grave she never lived to see vindicated. Every time I look at that wall hanging, I think of her sitting in her sewing room, her arthritic fingers carefully unpicking my stitches, and then sewing them back with a secret tucked inside, and I know that the foundation Tom always talked about was never made of concrete. It was made of thread, and it held. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and hit the bell for more tales of family betrayal and hard-won justice. Remember, the threads that hold your life together aren't always visible, but they are strong enough to survive any tear if you stitch them with integrity. I'll see you in the next story.